go into greater detail, we see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons." And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield.
As we sit here on the verge of World War III, this video was suggested to me by YouTube. Before we get into the video, though, let me just give this prerequisite video of little Adam Shit letting us know what we're doing over in Ukraine and why.
Moreover, as one witness put it during our impeachment inquiry, the United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
All right, we're fighting Russia over there so we don't have to fight Russia here. That's why we aid Ukraine and her people. So look at the title of this video. Russian airstrike on NATO-affiliated military base kills 35 and injures 134. And then look at the Chiron. Breaking news, Ukraine, 35 dead, 134 injured after airstrike on Yavoriv military base near Polish border. So Poland is a NATO ally. That's why they're bringing Poland into it, even though it's in Ukraine. It's near the Polish border. That's close to one of our allies, right? They're trying to drum up tension with that, as well as calling the base, quote, NATO affiliated. They're trying to blur the lines and bring us closer to hostility with Russia. But let's break down the video. Let's get into this unhinged video that's pure propaganda and warmongering.
Joining me, State Department spokesperson Ned Price. Ned, thank you very much for coming to the Sunday Show.
Morning, Jonathan.
So, Ned, I would love the U.S. reaction to the Russian attack on that Ukrainian military base outside of Lviv.
Well, Jonathan, over the course of the past 18 days now, we have seen Russia escalate its attacks against Ukraine. We have always said this would be a war really on three axes. One, a war against the territorial integrity of the state of Ukraine. Two, an assault on the Ukrainian government. And three, an assault on the Ukrainian people. And we've seen Russia escalate its tactics, escalate its operations over the course of these past 18 days on all three tracks. But here's the thing, Jonathan, we are nearly 3 weeks into this effort. And I think every day it has become clear that President Putin gravely miscalculated. Now, 3 weeks in, we have seen Russian forces in many areas stall. We've seen convoys unable to make significant progress. Now, clearly, they continue to pose a threat to major urban centers, including the 2.9 million people in the city of Kyiv. But if Vladimir Putin thought that his forces could go into Ukraine and would not find and confront stiff resistance from the people of Ukraine, he was mistaken. If Vladimir Putin thought that he wouldn't find stiff resistance at home from his own people, he was clearly mistaken. More than 14,000 Russians in Russia across dozens of cities have been detained, have been arrested for doing nothing more than exercising what is their universal right to freedom of expression, to freedom of assembly, protesting Putin's war of choice. And if Putin thought that he wouldn't face stiff resistance in these severe consequential measures from the United States and the international community that we warned about, he miscalculated. He was mistaken there as well.
God, bro, it's...
If Vladimir Putin thought.
God. These, like, rehearsed fucking talking points are so unbearable to listen to. But first, before we get deeper into the video, realize this. We're on the cusp of world war, nuclear war, global conflict, species annihilation. This guy is a talking head representing our government. And our news is going to bring on our government on the cusp of a war and just uncritically allow them to say whatever they want and not challenge him on anything, not ask him any legitimate questions, And in fact, he's going to help tee up what Jonathan Price is saying here. And I don't know if you know, but this guy is a joke. Like, the one time reporters asked him questions, he looked like a moron. That happened just a couple of weeks ago. He looked like an idiot. He looked like an absolute idiot. He was claiming that the evidence was that he said something. That's evidence of another nation's intentions. But either way, notice how the media is going to tee up a softball interview for our government official to saber rattle with a nuclear power and bring us closer to nuclear annihilation in World War III, right? But addressing some of the things he said.
Joining me.
Let's think about some of the stuff the United States has done. This is just our drone strike program. Killed from thousands of miles away. Individual targets are often identified and being killed at the press of a button from a drone predator operator sitting behind a screen thousands of miles away. However, leaked Pentagon documents show that during a 5-month period in 2013, 90% of those killed by U.S. drone strikes in Operation Haymaker in northeast Afghanistan were unintended targets. In other words, innocent civilians. We have a drone program that 90% of the time kills innocent civilians.
Even before I came into office, I was very clear that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks. We did some things that were contrary to our values.
So they're going to tell you that, Putin's bad. He targets civilians. He's a demagogue. He's a dictator. He's evil. He's a villain, right? Can he be trusted even in a diplomatic situation? He's targeting civilians. Can we even negotiate with a guy like this? This is the kind of bullshit narrative they're putting around this. Meanwhile, we have a drone program that 9 out of 10 times kills innocent civilians. Meanwhile, we literally created a torture program to cover up the fact that we started an illegal war in Iraq, and then we made a gulag in Cuba, as well as hundreds of black sites around the world where we tortured and continue to torture people. Or, I mean, folks. We tortured some folks, not people. They were folks.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
So, Madeleine Albright, this is Madeleine Albright getting interviewed in the first Iraq War, where our sanctions resulted in the death of 500,000 Iraqi children. And we think that's worth it. It's a tough choice, but obviously it's worth it. We got to kill kids. We got money to make. You got to kill the kids.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
And it is a pleasure to have you here. It's an honor to have a conversation with you.
Well, I'm delighted to be interviewed by you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, at least we have independent media, right? At least TYT exists to, make a historical accounting of figures like Madeleine Albright. Oh, wait, no, they go to the Munich Security Conference and help do propaganda to sell, weapons. That's what they really do. So we have a drone program, we have a torture program, we start 1 million illegal wars. Our allies are people like Saudi Arabia, who just 3 days ago, executed 81 people in one day, the biggest mass execution in decades. Saudi Arabia executed 81 men on Saturday, including 7 Yemenis and 1 Syrian, for terrorism and other offenses, including holding deviant beliefs, authorities said, in the biggest mass execution in decades. Those are good people in Saudi Arabia, and we also happen to be helping them do a war and genocide on the people of Yemen. This is from the United Nations Global Perspective Human Stories. Ooh. Yemen facing outright catastrophe over rising hunger, warns UN humanitarians. So in Yemen is the biggest famine in the world in a long time. And that alone is devastating. But the famine exists not because of some act of God, but because the United States and Saudi Arabia have been bombing the shit out of Yemen. All right? This is a couple years ago. Remember the one time the media did their job with Yemen and talked about it for 5 minutes? And, you know, we were all shocked that our missiles were blowing up buses full of little kids. Remember that?
Every day, Zaid al-Humran visits the graveyard where his 2 little boys are buried. Today, he brought their 5-year-old brother along. He's all Zaid has left.
People were screaming out the names of their children. I tried to tell the women it couldn't be true, but then a man ran through the crowd, shouting that a plane had struck the children's bus.
On August 9th, Zaid's son Osama filmed his class on their long-awaited school trip, a reward for graduating summer school. Within hours, and it had all gone horribly wrong. A plane from the US-backed Saudi-led coalition struck a bus carrying them. Dozens died. Some of the bodies were so mutilated, identification became impossible. All that's left are the scraps of school books, warped metal, and a simple backpack. Eyewitnesses tell CNN this was a direct hit in the middle of a busy market.
So yeah, we just bomb school buses full of children in the middle of busy markets. But, you know, can we trust Putin at this negotiating table? I don't know. Let's continue on the propaganda train here.
Ned, how will the United States respond if indeed Russia goes through with the reported false flag operation and uses chemical weapons on the Ukrainian people?
Well, let me say, Jonathan, we're concerned about this, and you've heard of our concern over recent days, and there are really 2 elements that undergird that concern. First, we know the track record. We know that the Russian Federation and President Putin has employed these weapons, chemical weapons, against others in the past. He's done so on his own soil.
The United States has never done that.
In Europe, against perceived dissidents in both places. He supported the Assad regime and its brutal campaign using chemical weapons against its own people. So that we know. We also know the Russian tactics and the Russian playbook. And if you were to diagnose Russia, you might claim, you might be able to say that they have what's called a case of projection. They are projecting onto others what they intend to do, or in some cases have already done. And so that's why we're very concerned to hear Russian officials make these baseless, false claims that the United States or Ukraine or any other country has an active chemical warfare program, that we're preparing a chemical attack or a biological attack against Russian forces, against Russian speakers in Ukraine. Of course, we all know that nothing could be further from the truth, but it does add to our concern because we know this tactic of projection. The Russians accuse others of what they may have in mind. We're not going to spell out what precisely what happened in the case of this horrifying hypothetical, but as you heard from the president yesterday, Vladimir Putin, Russia would pay a very, very, very severe price.
So notice the framing of this conversation before we dig into the specifics of this moron's statement there. Notice how there's no pushback, there's no how do we avoid conflict? It's like there's going to be a false flag, and it's totally Russia's fault. How bad are we going to fuck them up for it? It's like the only acceptable debate is how much of a response militarily should we have. It's not, should we respond militarily? Should we respond diplomatically? Should we be doing this? Should we be doing that? Why did our government do a coup? Why are we, pumping weapons in there? Why are we waging economic warfare? No, it's none of that stuff. It's, oh, interesting. So how much of a response should the U.S. have? How much bombs should we drop? That's always the question in the media. He mentioned, he's asking about a possible false flag, right? And then he mentioned Russia helped Assad in Syria, and Syria's bad people because Assad's a bad person and he gasses his own people, and so does Putin, and they're all about gassing people, and they're crazy and they're evil. Well, let's go back to my birthday, actually, Tuesday, April 17th, 2018. This is the late, great Robert Fisk doing actual reporting. Now, 99.99999% of the reports that came around Duma were from a dude in New York or Washington being fed a piece of paper from CIA assets. Robert Fisk happens to be an actual journalist and actually went there and asked people questions. So let's read a little bit from his article. The search for truth in the rubble of Duma. One doctor's doubts over the chemical attack. Robert Fisk visits the Syria clinic at the center of a global crisis. So after this Duma attack, there was a viral video of a basement clinic, people in there getting hosed down, white helmets, people screaming. It looks like chaos. They're saying it's a chemical attack. Wash yourselves, wash yourself, wash yourself. Robert Fisk went and talked to the doctor who runs that clinic and was in that video. This is a story of a town called Duma, a ravaged, stinking place of smashed apartment blocks, and of an underground clinic whose images of suffering allowed 3 of the Western world's most powerful nations to bomb Syria last week. There's even a friendly doctor in a green coat who, when I track him down in the very same clinic, cheerfully tells me that the gas videotape, which horrified the world, despite all the doubters, is perfectly genuine. War stories, however, have a habit of growing darker. For the same 50-year-old senior Syrian doctor then adds something profoundly uncomfortable. The patients, he says, were overcome not by gas but by oxygen starvation in the rubbish-filled tunnels and basements in which they lived, on a night of wind and heavy shelling that stirred up a dust storm. So basically, these people live in a war zone. Lots of people are sleeping in underground tunnels and bunkers and shelters, and the city is completely destroyed. There's tons of dust. It's an arid region anyway. And when there was a bombing going on, the tunnels were getting filled with dust, and then people were having oxygen starvation. That's what was really happening in that video. What happened was the white helmets, which are Western assets, went in there and made it look like a chemical attack because they have reasons. And the reasons are, if you could show the world that there are people suffering, the West will come and bomb people, right? So basically, the jihadists were losing, Assad was winning, and if they can make it look like Assad is gassing people, then the West will come in and bomb Assad, giving those jihadists, those rebels, more of a chance in their fight. Okay? But let's listen in. This is the great Aaron Mate, the Buzzsaw, winner of the Izzy Award, and he's going to kind of give a quick summary of that situation.
Could you provide us a background to this scandal, specifically going back to the events in April of 2018?
So April 2018, there's claims of a chemical attack in the Syrian city of Duma. Videos are put out showing scores of dead bodies inside of a building. There's also video of a scene inside of a hospital where people are being hosed down with water, and this was put out by the White Helmets, which is a US and UK and Gulf and Turkey backed group. Before the OPCW can get its inspectors into Duma to investigate, the US, Britain, and France bombed Syria based on the...
So before investigators could go there, the US and its Western allies bombed the evidence. So they destroyed the crime scene. So there couldn't be a proper forensic investigation. A cover-up.
That this was a chemical attack and that the Syrian government was guilty. Then the OPCW gets in, they do an investigation, they put out an interim report in July of 2018 that doesn't really offer much in the way of anything definitive in terms of who was guilty and even what this was. But that changes in March of 2019 when the OPCW puts out a final report where they say that there are reasonable grounds to believe that a chemical weapon took place with chlorine. And the inference of the report is that Syria is in fact guilty because they strongly suggest that gas cylinders that were found at the scene in Douma were dropped from the air. So the inference of the report is that Syria is guilty of a chemical weapons attack. But then, shortly afterwards, we get...
But then the reality comes out.
The first of a pretty extraordinary set of leaks from inside the OPCW, which says that, contrary to what the OPCW said publicly, the actual inspectors who went to Syria, conducted the investigation, reached a much different conclusion. They actually found no evidence at all of a chemical weapons attack in Douma, including with chlorine, but their findings were censored. There was an original report, which the public never saw, which the original team drafted. That report was not only kept from the public, but in fact, people above the inspectors who wrote that report, some unknown senior officials, tried to doctor it and add a whole bunch of new unsupported conclusions immediately that pointed blame to the Syrian government, even though all the available evidence contained none of what the senior officials were trying to say. So there was not just a suppression of the original report, but an attempt to doctor it and manipulate it to say things that the inspectors had not found. Now, that attempt was thwarted to put out this bogus report, but the original report was still suppressed, and that is then what produced the interim report that the public first got in July of 2018. And after that, basically all of the original inspectors who went to Syria and produced the original report, they were removed from the investigation. There was one exception, a paramedic, who didn't have really anything to do with the science involved. So all of them were removed, and they were replaced by a group of people who did not set foot in Syria, and they were the ones who produced the final report.
Interesting.
From more leaks, we saw that they excluded other key findings that undermined all the claims that the OPCW was saying publicly. So that is this scandal, and the response to it has been pretty significant and pretty much as damning as the original cover-up, because there's been an attempt by the US, Britain, and France, the same governments that bombed Syria, to suppress this story. So when Joseph Bustani, the first Director General of the OPCW, when he came to the UN Security Council this past fall to speak in defense of the OPCW whistleblowers and to criticize the cover-up, the US and its allies blocked him from speaking.
Do you see the game being played? And then people like Ned Price go on TV and tell Russia that they're evil and they use chemicals. And, you know, they got to be willing to negotiate. He goes on TV to the American citizen audience. It seems like he's being tough on a bad guy and that he's drawing a red line for humanity and freedom and all that. But in reality, what he's doing is he's going on TV and he's signaling to Russia that we're not backing down. That's what he's really doing. He's signaling to Russia that we're not backing down, that this is about our expansion. This is about your death as a regional power. Just one more quick little aside about Russia's involvement in Syria, because I've heard people be like, Russia is so bad. They've been in Syria, they've been in Georgia, they've been in Ukraine and Crimea and this and that. It's like, actually, Russia was invited to Syria, and they were invited to Syria by the Assad government. And Russia had an interest in stopping the Assad government from collapsing because there was another force that was trying to assume power in the vacuum of the crumbling Syrian government. So if you don't believe me, let's listen to, you know, the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, explain it.
The reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was...
Russia came in because they didn't want ISIS to take over Syria. That's what he's saying. And he's also saying that we were letting ISIS grow to put pressure on Assad. I mean,
Well, we were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength, and
we still illegally occupy a third of Syria right now. You know, the part of Syria that has the oil and the wheat fields, that's the part we occupy.
Assad was strength. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin to support it.
And what John Kerry means by forcing Assad to negotiate, you know, he's talking about, oh, we were letting ISIS run rampant throughout Syria so we could force Assad to the negotiation table. And what is the negotiation table? It's the U.S. demanding that Assad step down and replace him with, you know, fill-in friendly business asset. So they were allowing terrorists to behead people, all kinds of crazy nonsense, and acting as their de facto air force, by the way, which is a whole other subject, just so we could get Putin out of just so we can get Assad out of power. It's ridiculous.
All right, I was going to ask, you could be concerned, but will that lead to a military response from the West if he does indeed do that? But rather than have you repeat what you just said, I want to move on to Belarus. How concerned is the United States about the potential for Belarus to commit troops to fight with Russia?
Well, Jonathan, Belarus should be a sovereign, independent country. But in recent months...
And Ukraine should be a sovereign and independent country, but you guys overthrew their government in 2014, empowered a bunch of Nazis and ultra-nationalists, and gave them a bunch of weapons and unleashed a civil war for the past 7 years. But yeah, let's talk more about how Belarus is bad.
The Lukashenko regime has essentially ceded the sovereignty, ceded the independence of its country, of its proud country, to President Putin, to the Russian Federation. We've seen that very clearly over the course of the past few months when tens of thousands of Russian forces poured into what should have been sovereign Belarusian territory to take part in what the Russians and the Lukashenko regime claimed, falsely, of course, we all see now, were exercises. And we have no doubt that if Putin, given the control that he wields over the Lukashenko regime, were to need additional reinforcements, that Belarusian forces would flow over the border. These are not forces that are under, in some ways, the sovereign control of the Lukashenko regime. Putin wields nearly absolute control over that country. We've seen that in recent days, and that's our concern going forward.
You know, Ned Price said a lot about projection a couple of clips ago. This is all the United States does is projection. So they can't believe that Belarus would, you know, oh my God, I can't believe they would help Russia. I can't believe Russia has an ally. I can't believe. What do you think we've done with Europe? What do you think NATO is? It's an aggressive, expansionist alliance that serves the imperialist interests of the United States. I mean, he's talking about Belarus. Let's look at NATO expansion. There were 5 major waves of NATO expansion after the collapse of the Soviet Union: 99, 2004, 2009, 2017, and 2020. When we agreed to unify Germany, right? We agreed that if Russia allowed Germany to unify and join NATO, that we would not expand NATO 1 inch east of Germany. Now let's watch what happened. Watch the expansion. And then when you become a partner in NATO, when you become a member of NATO, you're now under the imperialist thumb of the United States. We're now going to mandate that you spend a certain amount of money on your military and buy a bunch of weapons from us. We're going to mandate you get into all kinds of unilateral, bilateral, multilateral trade deals. We're going to do all this stuff to determine how you run your country. You don't believe me? Just ask the Ukrainians themselves. This is from the LA Times. Here is what Joe Biden actually did in Ukraine. I used this article before in another video. Here's a quick excerpt. The vice president had planned to announce a $1 billion in U.S. loan guarantees for Ukraine, but en route to Kiev on Air Force Two, Biden changed his mind. Poroshenko was dragging his feet, building the institutions needed to take on corruption, aides said. Biden and his staff rewrote the speech, removing the loan guarantees. That's Joe Biden acting as imperial overlord to the vassal state of Ukraine. He's demanding that they run their internal legal affairs, their internal justice department the way he prefers. And if not, he's going to cancel billions of dollars for them. Let's continue on, though. Right? So we're going to hear about the Belarusians. Putin controls this other country. They don't have their own sovereignty. Meanwhile, what do you think the United States does the world over? We are the world's sole superpower. Why do we have 1,000 bases around the world? What are we doing in Africa? What are we doing in South America? What are we doing in the Middle East? What are we doing in Southeast Asia?
All right, I was going to ask, you could be concerned, but will that lead to a military response from the... We've talked about the phone calls between the French, Germans, and Putin over the last week, but there were reports that Jerusalem could be the site of peace talks. What's the
Jerusalem,
United States and the role
Israel
is playing in trying to broker peace and trying to make those peace talks happen?
Well, there are a number of countries with whom we're working very closely, Jonathan, on coordinated diplomatic efforts. We were in Europe earlier this week. As you know, we had an opportunity to meet with the Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. He briefed Secretary Blinken and the team on Prime Minister Bennett's efforts to engage in diplomacy. Our French allies have done the same. On the way back to the United States earlier this week, we stopped in Paris. We met with President Macron. Heard directly from him and his team about the French efforts to engage in diplomacy. We've been in close touch with our German allies. President
Diplomacy.
Biden spoke earlier this week with President Erdogan of Turkey. And Turkey, of course, was the site of a ministerial level meeting between Foreign Minister Lavrov in Russia and Foreign Minister Kuleba of Ukraine. So we are supportive of every diplomatic effort that is done in full coordination and consultation with, in the first instance, Ukraine, and that's most important, but that's also done in full coordination with us. All of
because we're the boss.
Are being done in coordination with us.
In
Ukraine, and we'll continue to
because we're the boss.
Engage in them and to support them in any way we can. But here's the thing. Diplomacy can only succeed if the Russians are serious about it. And to date, we've seen them take part in what appears to us to be the pretense of diplomacy. That is to say, they're going through the diplomatic motions. They are trying to fool the world.
Projection.
Believing that they are serious about diplomacy when they are investing continuously in the war machine in Ukraine. They are escalating day by day. So we're trying to do two things to change the calculus. We're continuing to...
Is he talking about himself?
Partners, including with massive amounts of security assistance, just as we continue to escalate our own measures to bring additional significant costs on President Putin's economy, President Putin's financial system, and ultimately his strategic positioning in the world. And with his strategic positioning, regardless of how or when this ends, Russia will be weaker, NATO and the international community will be stronger, more united, more purposeful than we have been in many years.
And that's what this is really about. This is about U.S. imperialism. This is about us regaining our grip because we're a flailing, dying empire, and we don't want Europe to get more independent from us, and we don't want Russia to be a counterbalance to us, and we don't want Russia there as an available asset and ally to China because we want to wage world war with them because we don't want to give up our grip on running the world's economy. But God, Ned Price is projection filled. But let's talk about Israel wants to broker the peace deal. Human Rights Watch, Israeli war crimes apparent in the Gaza war. Jerusalem, where they want to do the peace talks, right? Human Rights Watch on Tuesday accused the Israeli military of carrying out attacks that apparently amount to war crimes during an 11-day war in May against the Hamas militant group. The International Human Rights Organization issued its conclusions after investigating 3 Israeli airstrikes that it said killed 62 Palestinian civilians. It said there were no evident military targets in the vicinity of the attacks. So the Israelis that regularly practice apartheid and genocide want to broker peace because Putin's bad. And to kind of bridge the gap between Israel's hypocrisy and this current war, this video was shared around as if it was a young Ukrainian girl fighting off Russian invaders. Meanwhile, it's a young Palestinian girl fighting off Israeli oppressors and occupiers. Does it look like Ukraine? It's a fucking desert. She's in a tank top. It's winter in Europe. So in this country, everyone was sharing videos of her punching the Israeli soldiers, saying, you know, brave Ukrainian girl. Meanwhile, you paid for this girl to be tortured. You paid for this Israelis sickos to torture this girl and her family and their people. You paid for this apartheid. You paid for this genocide. So there's the real person. She's not Ukrainian. This made me laugh, but this also, I mean, at the end of this little diatribe here, he goes on to talk about how, you know, at the very end, you know, America's going to be stronger, NATO's going to be more unified, and Russia's going to be weaker. That's the whole goal of this. Isolation of Russia, our grip regaining upon Europe and its markets and its militaries and our allies. And, you know, this is a desperate attempt by a failing superpower to retain its supremacy over the world.
More united, more purposeful than we have been in many years.
This made me laugh. After all this propaganda, this is what comes up at the end. This is who we are. This is who we are. It's pure propaganda. You want one last laugh? Let's
go into greater detail. We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield.
It's day 7.
So there's Brian William cumming his pants. Fareed Zakaria is about to do the same. Why? Because the U.S. did an illegal missile strike to another sovereign country that's actually fighting ISIS, that's fighting terrorists. So, I mean, if you can't see the hypocrisy of our society, of our government, or of our media right now, trying to paint Putin as a one-note villain and disregarding the rest of reality and all context, I don't know what to tell you. Let's listen to Fareed cum his pants.
Of the Trump presidency, what changed last night?
I think Donald Trump became president of the United States. I think this was actually a big moment because candidate Trump had said that he would never get involved in the Syrian civil war. He told President Obama,
candidate Trump was right. President Trump was wrong.
You cannot do this without the authorization of Congress. He seemed unconcerned with global norms,
President Trump recognized that the President of the United States does have to act to enforce international norms.
That's so insane what he just said. He was saying that Trump was saying that in order to do war, we need to use Congress, which is correct. And then in the same sentence, he was like, and he doesn't, care about international norms. That would be the international norm that we're supposed to follow, which is not to do offensive wars and to actually declare war and not just willy-nilly have a guy have the power to do war whenever he wants without asking Congress. It's ridiculous. This guy's insane. This guy's fucking insane. And they're celebrating Trump being unhinged, not being reserved. This is the only time they gave Trump praise. And that should show you what our culture, what our society, what our government, what our media, what they really are all about. They don't care about innocent Ukrainians. They don't think, let's just listen.
To have this broader moral and political purpose, President Trump realized, as every president has for many decades now, that presidents always believe they have inherent legal authority as commander-in-chief, and they don't need to go to a pesky Congress every time they want.
Fuck the law.
It's entirely true that candidate Trump felt differently. Candidate Obama felt differently than President Obama on these issues. So I think that what is interesting is even the way in which he justified his actions, President Trump did. For the first time, really, as president, he talked about international norms, international rules, about America's role in enforcing justice.
About America's role in not following any of the rules.
That we have come to expect from American presidents since Harry Truman. But it was the kind of rhetoric that President Trump had pointedly never used, either on the campaign trail nor in his inaugural. So I think there has been an interesting morphing and a kind of education of Donald Trump.
The education and morphing is that the military and industrial complex and the deep state will always get to dictate our foreign policy.
Dylan! You son of a bitch.